It was just another ordinary Tuesday afternoon at the local supermarket. The air conditioning hummed softly as shoppers pushed their carts down aisles filled with fresh produce, canned goods, and snacks. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking for candy, while cashiers scanned items at the checkout counters with practiced efficiency. Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. Officer Greg Miller walked through the automatic doors, his hands full of groceries. He had stopped by the store after finishing his shift earlier that day, still wearing his badge clipped to his belt even though he was technically off duty. To him, the badge wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was part of who he was. It gave him a sense of importance, a feeling that people should respect him no matter where he went. But today, that belief would be tested in ways he could never have imagined. Greg wandered aimlessly through the aisles, grabbing things here and there without much thought. His mind drifted to recent events in the city, a string of petty crimes, complaints about overcrowding, and rising tensions between residents and law enforcement. As a police officer, Greg often found himself frustrated by what he saw as a lack of gratitude from certain groups. In his mind, they didn't understand how hard he worked to keep everyone safe. Sometimes those frustrations bubbled over into harsh judgments about people based on their appearance or accent. Today, however, those biases would lead him down a path he couldn't undo. At the same time, Lieutenant Maria Lopez entered the supermarket from the opposite side. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, blending in seamlessly with the other customers. No one would have guessed that beneath her calm exterior lay years of discipline, sacrifice, and service to her country. Maria had served 2 tours overseas and earned numerous medals for bravery under fire. Now back home, she balanced her responsibilities as a senior Army officer with caring for her family. Today, she was simply running errands, picking up supplies before heading to dinner with her husband and kids. Maria moved quickly through the store, her cart filling up with essentials. As she waited in line at the checkout counter, she pulled out her phone to call her sister. Speaking in fluent Spanish, she laughed warmly, sharing stories about her nieces and nephews. Her voice carried easily over the low murmur of conversations around her. For Maria, this was a moment of peace, a rare break from the demands of her job and personal life. But not everyone shared her sense of calm. Standing just a few feet away, Greg noticed Maria almost immediately. At first, he only heard her voice, which stood out against the English-dominated chatter of the crowd. Something about the rhythm of her words made him pause. Then he saw her, dark hair tied back neatly, olive skin glowing under the fluorescent lights. To Greg, she looked different, foreign, and when he realized she was speaking Spanish, his suspicions deepened. "Excuse me?" Greg said loudly, stepping closer to Maria. His tone was sharp, cutting through the ambient noise like a knife. Several shoppers turned to look, startled by the sudden intrusion. Maria glanced up, mildly surprised. "Yes?" she replied politely, switching to English without missing a beat. "I need to see some ID," Greg demanded, his hand resting conspicuously on the holster of his gun. His posture was rigid, his eyes narrowed. Maria frowned, confused. "ID? Why?" "You're speaking another language," Greg shot back, his voice rising slightly. "How do I know you're even supposed to be here?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Maria felt a flicker of irritation but forced herself to remain calm. She had dealt with situations like this before, both in uniform and out of it. Experience had taught her that losing her temper wouldn't help. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out her military ID, holding it up for Greg to see. "I'm Lieutenant Maria Lopez," she said firmly, enunciating each word. "I've served my country for over 15 years. Does that satisfy your curiosity?" For a brief moment, Greg hesitated. The ID looked legitimate, and Maria's demeanor radiated authority. But instead of backing down, his pride kicked in. He didn't want to appear weak, especially in front of the growing number of onlookers. So rather than apologizing, he doubled down. "That doesn't mean anything," Greg snapped. "Anyone can fake an ID these days." Maria's patience began to wear thin. "Are you serious right now? I'm standing in a supermarket buying groceries. What exactly do you think I'm doing wrong?" Her question seemed to catch Greg off guard, but only for a second. Without thinking, he unholstered his gun and pointed it directly at her. The metallic click echoed through the store, freezing everyone in place. Gasps rippled through the crowd as shoppers scrambled to get out of the way. Some ducked behind shelves, while others whipped out their phones to record the scene. Maria froze too, though not out of fear. She stared straight at Greg, her eyes blazing with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Are you really going to pull a weapon on a U.S. Army officer?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Greg's face flushed red, partly from embarrassment and partly from stubbornness. He knew he'd crossed a line, but admitting it felt impossible. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered defensively. "No, you're not," Maria countered sharply. "You're letting your prejudice dictate your actions. And trust me, this isn't going to end well for you." By now, the entire store had come to a standstill. Dozens of phones were trained on Greg and Maria, capturing every word, every movement. Someone uploaded the video online within minutes, and it spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Hashtags like Our Justice for Maria and Accountability Now trended almost instantly, drawing attention from all corners of the country. As the situation escalated, Greg became increasingly aware of the weight of his mistake. But instead of de-escalating, he dug his heels in further. "Step aside," he growled, gesturing toward the exit with his free hand. "We'll sort this out later." Maria didn't budge. "No," she said firmly. "This ends now. Put the gun down." Her composure unnerved Greg, shaking the fragile foundation of his authority. For a split second, he considered holstering the weapon and walking away, but pride and fear of looking weak kept him rooted in place. The standoff continued, each second stretching longer than the last. Finally, a brave shopper stepped forward. "Sir, please put the gun down," the man pleaded. "This isn't necessary." Others joined in, their voices forming a chorus of disapproval. Sensing that the tide had turned against him, Greg reluctantly lowered his weapon and backed away. Maria watched silently as he stormed out of the store, leaving behind a trail of stunned witnesses. In the aftermath, the mood shifted from tension to relief. People approached Maria, offering words of support and admiration. One woman hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for standing up to him," the woman whispered. "You're a hero." Maria managed a small smile, though her heart was still racing. She knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. Outside, Greg sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He replayed the incident in his mind, searching for excuses, rationalizations, anything to justify his behavior. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had acted out of bias, not reason. And soon, the world would know it too. The next morning, the supermarket incident dominated every news channel, newspaper, and social media platform. By sunrise, the video of Officer Greg Miller pulling his gun on Lieutenant Maria Lopez had been viewed millions of times. People couldn't stop talking about it. The footage showed everything: the aggressive stance of the officer, Maria's calm but firm response, and the horrified reactions of bystanders. It was raw, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. News anchors debated the story during breakfast shows, their voices tinged with disbelief and outrage. One anchor shook his head as he introduced a segment. "This is not just an isolated incident," he said gravely. "It's a reflection of deeper issues within our society." Another reporter interviewed shoppers who had witnessed the altercation firsthand. "I thought I was going to see someone get shot," one woman recalled, her voice trembling. "It was terrifying." Meanwhile, hashtags like Justice for Maria and Our Accountability now flooded Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. People shared memes, opinion pieces, and personal stories of similar encounters with law enforcement. Veterans groups rallied behind Maria, praising her courage and calling for systemic change. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning Greg's actions and demanding immediate consequences. For Maria, the day began quietly. She woke up early, made coffee, and sat by the window, watching the sun rise over her neighborhood. Her husband, Carlos, joined her after a while, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked gently. Maria nodded, though her expression betrayed a hint of unease. "I knew this might happen," she admitted, "but I didn't think it would blow up like this." Carlos sighed, squeezing her hand. "You stood your ground, Maria. That's all anyone can ask of you." As the hours passed, reporters started gathering outside their home. At first, there were only a few, but soon the street was lined with news vans and cameras. Maria stepped outside briefly to address them, flanked by Carlos and her best friend Rachel. Dressed in her army uniform, she spoke with quiet authority, her words cutting through the noise. "What happened yesterday should never have occurred," she began, her voice steady. "No one deserves to be treated that way, especially in a place as ordinary as a supermarket. I'm sharing my story because I hope it sparks a conversation, a real conversation, about respect, accountability, and how we treat each other." Her statement sent shockwaves through the crowd. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks while photographers snapped pictures nonstop. When she finished speaking, Maria retreated inside, leaving Rachel to handle follow-up questions. As the door closed behind her, she leaned against the wall, exhaling deeply. For all her strength, the weight of the attention was exhausting. The other side of town, Greg Miller woke up to a very different reality. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. Most of the messages were critical, accusing him of racism and abuse of power. A few defended him, but their support felt hollow compared to the overwhelming tide of anger directed his way. Greg's wife, Linda, watched him scroll through the comments, her face pale with worry. "Greg, what were you thinking?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. "You pulled a gun on a war hero. Do you realize how bad this looks?" "I was doing my job," Greg muttered defensively, though his tone lacked conviction. She was speaking another language. How was I supposed to know she wasn't hiding something? Linda shook her head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's not an excuse, and you know it. You let your biases cloud your judgment. Now look, where it's gotten us." Greg didn't respond. Instead, he stared out the window, his mind racing. He replayed the incident over and over again, trying to justify his actions. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the truth. He had acted impulsively, letting pride and prejudice override common sense. Later that afternoon, Greg received a call from his superior officer, Captain Harris. "We need to talk," Harris said bluntly. "Come to headquarters immediately." The drive to the police station felt endless. Every car that passed seemed to glare at him. Every pedestrian judged him. When Greg arrived, he was ushered into a small conference room where Harris waited, arms crossed. The captain's expression was grim. "This is bad, Greg," Harris began without preamble. "Really bad. The department's reputation is on the line because of what you did. We've already received hundreds of complaints and the mayor wants answers." Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Harris cut him off. "Save it. You're suspended pending an investigation. Turn in your badge and gun. Effective immediately." The words hit Greg like a punch to the gut. Suspended? Without his badge? It felt like losing a part of himself. He handed over his equipment reluctantly, his hands shaking slightly. As he left the building, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions and shoving microphones in his face. Greg pushed past them, his jaw clenched tightly. Back at home, the tension between Greg and Linda reached a boiling point. "You brought this on yourself," she snapped as they sat down to dinner, or rather as Greg picked at his food while Linda glared at him. "Do you even understand how serious this is? Our lives are falling apart because of your ego." "I made a mistake, okay?" Greg shot back, slamming his fist on the table. "But I'm not the villain everyone's making me out to be." Linda threw up her hands in exasperation. "Yes, you are. You pointed a loaded gun at an innocent woman just because she spoke Spanish. How is that not being a villain?" The argument went on late into the night, neither side willing to back down. Eventually, Linda stormed off to bed, leaving Greg alone in the living room. He poured himself a drink and sank into the couch, staring blankly at the TV. News channels continued to cover the story, analyzing every detail of the incident. Each report felt like another nail in his coffin. Despite the chaos surrounding them, Maria remained focused on moving forward. She spent the evening talking to Rachel about next steps. "I want to turn this into something positive," Maria explained. "Maybe work with advocacy groups to push for reforms in law enforcement. What do you think?" Rachel smiled encouragingly. "I think that's exactly what you should do. You have a platform now, Maria. Use it." Inspired by Rachel's words, Maria drafted a plan. She would reach out to organizations dedicated to improving relations between police officers and minority communities. Together, they could create programs aimed at fostering mutual understanding and accountability. It wouldn't fix everything overnight, but it was a start. As the night wore on, both Maria and Greg found themselves reflecting on the events of the past 24 hours. For Maria, the experience reinforced her belief in the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. For Greg, it served as a painful reminder of the consequences of unchecked bias and misplaced pride. Neither of them realized it yet, but their paths were far from over. The incident had set off a chain reaction, one that would force both individuals and the community they lived in to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and each other. And though the road ahead promised to be challenging, it also held the potential for growth, reconciliation, and change. By the time dawn broke the following day, the world had shifted slightly. Conversations about race, privilege, and justice echoed louder than ever before. And in the midst of it all stood Maria and Greg, two people whose lives had collided in ways neither could have predicted. The days following the supermarket incident were long and grueling for both Greg Miller and Maria Lopez, but they experienced them in very different ways. For Greg, life had become a series of sleepless nights and awkward silences. Suspended from the police force and stripped of his badge, he felt like a ghost haunting his own home. His once proud demeanor was replaced by a mix of anger, shame, and confusion. Every time he turned on the TV or opened social media, he saw Maria's face, heard her voice, and felt the weight of what he'd done pressing down on him. Linda, Greg's wife, tried to be supportive, but their relationship was strained. She avoided talking about the incident directly, though her disapproval was clear in the way she looked at him during meals or when he snapped at her over small things. "You need to take responsibility," she told him one evening after another. Heated argument. "This isn't just about you anymore, it's bigger than that." Greg wanted to argue, to insist that he wasn't entirely wrong. But deep down he knew Linda was right. He couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had cracked, a part of his identity tied to being a police officer. Without his badge, who was he? What purpose did he serve? His thoughts drifted back to moments in his career when he'd acted out of bias rather than reason. One memory stood out vividly. A young black teenager he'd stopped years ago for walking too slowly in a wealthy neighborhood. Greg had been convinced the kid was up to no good, only to discover later that the boy was simply visiting his grandmother. At the time, Greg brushed it off as a harmless mistake, but now the memory gnawed at him. Had there been other cases like that? Other people whose lives he'd disrupted because of assumptions based on race or appearance? Meanwhile, Maria faced her own challenges. While she was hailed as a hero by many, the emotional toll of the incident lingered. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Carlos and the kids were asleep, she sat by the window staring at the stars. Though she appeared strong in public, privately, she wrestled with feelings of vulnerability and frustration. Why did situations like this keep happening? Why did people see her, or anyone who looked like her, as less American, less deserving of respect? Her best friend Rachel noticed the change in Maria almost immediately. "You don't have to carry all this alone," Rachel said one evening as they sat together on the couch. "Let others help you. You've already inspired so many people just by standing your ground." Maria sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know. But sometimes it feels like nothing will ever really change. People cheer for me now, but will they still care next month, next year?" Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe not everyone will. But even if just a few people start questioning their biases or pushing for reform, That's progress, and you can lead the way. Encouraged by Rachel's words, Maria decided to channel her energy into action. She reached out to several advocacy groups focused on improving relations between law enforcement and minority communities. One organization, led by a former Marine named Kevin, invited her to speak at an upcoming event aimed at fostering dialogue between civilians and police officers. Maria hesitated at first. Public speaking made her nervous, but she eventually agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to make a difference. As the weeks passed, Greg found himself attending mandatory diversity training sessions as part of his suspension agreement. At first, he approached these meetings with skepticism, rolling his eyes at phrases like implicit bias and systemic racism. He sat slouched in his chair, arms crossed, convinced that this was all a waste of time. But then, something unexpected happened. During one session, Kevin, the same trainer who had invited Maria to speak, shared a personal story that resonated deeply with Greg. Kevin talked about growing up in a predominantly white town and constantly feeling like an outsider. He described an encounter with a police officer who had pulled him over for no apparent reason other than the color of his skin. The officer's tone had been dismissive, his questions invasive. It wasn't until Kevin showed his military ID that the officer finally let him go. "I joined the Marines partly because I wanted to prove I belonged," Kevin admitted, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I also wanted to challenge stereotypes to show people that we're more alike than we are different." Greg listened intently, his defenses slowly lowering. For the first time, he began to see how his actions might have affected Maria, not just in the moment, but in the broader context of her life. The realization hit him hard. He had treated her like an outsider, someone unworthy of trust, simply because of her ethnicity. That wasn't justice. It was prejudice. After the session ended, Greg approached Kevin cautiously. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice quieter than usual. Kevin nodded, sensing Greg's sincerity. "Of course. What do you do when you realize you've messed up big time?" Greg asked, avoiding eye contact. "How do you fix it?" Kevin studied him for a moment before responding. "You start by owning your mistakes," he said, firmly. "Apologize sincerely, not just to save face, but because you genuinely regret what you did. Then use your experience to educate others. Show them that change is possible." Greg nodded slowly, absorbing the advice. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he could make amends. Maybe he could find a way to move forward. Back at home, Greg shared some of what he'd learned with Linda. To his surprise, she listened without interrupting, her expression softening as he spoke. "I'm trying, Linda," he admitted. "I don't know if it's enough, but I want to do better." Linda reached out and took his hand. "That's a start, Greg. Just keep going." Around the same time, Maria prepared for her first major speech at the advocacy event. As she stood backstage, adjusting her uniform and reviewing her notes, she felt a surge of nerves. Hundreds of people filled the auditorium, including members of law enforcement, community leaders, and ordinary citizens, eager to learn. Rachel gave her a reassuring smile. "You've got this," she whispered. "Just be yourself." When Maria stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. She paused for a moment, taking in the sea of faces before beginning her speech. Her voice was steady, her words heartfelt. "We live in a world where fear often divides us," she said, addressing the audience. "But fear doesn't have to define us. We can choose to listen, to understand, and to work together toward a future where everyone feels safe and respected." As she spoke, Greg watched the live stream from his living room, captivated by her message. For the first time, he truly understood the impact of his actions and the potential for redemption. Though their journeys were far from over, both Greg and Maria had taken important steps toward healing. The road ahead would be challenging, but it held the promise of growth, reconciliation, and meaningful change. The disciplinary hearing took place in a packed courtroom, its walls lined with dark wood and its air thick with tension. Rows of chairs were filled with journalists, activists, and curious citizens eager to witness the outcome of the case. At the front of the room, a panel of senior officers and legal experts sat behind a long table, their faces stern as they reviewed stacks of documents and evidence. The mood was heavy, almost suffocating, as everyone waited for the proceedings to begin. Greg Miller arrived early, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie in the mirror of a nearby restroom. He had spent hours preparing for this moment, rehearsing what he would say and how he would explain himself. But no amount of preparation could ease the knot in his stomach or the pounding in his chest. As he entered the courtroom, cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions at him. "Officer Miller, do you regret your actions?" one yelled. Another asked, "Do you believe you're being treated unfairly?" Greg ignored them, keeping his gaze fixed ahead as he took his seat. His lawyer, a middle-aged man named Robert, leaned over and whispered reassurances. "Stick to the script," Robert advised. "Stay calm and let me handle the tough parts." On the other side of the room, Maria Lopez sat quietly, her posture straight and composed. She wore her military uniform, complete with medals that glinted under the fluorescent lights. Her presence commanded respect even from those who didn't know her personally. Next to her sat her attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Angela, who had been instrumental in building Maria's case. Together, they radiated strength and determination. As the hearing began, the head of the review board, a grizzled veteran named Captain Lewis, called the room to order. "This hearing will now commence," he announced, his voice firm and authoritative. "We are here to determine whether Officer Gregory Miller violated department policies and procedures during an altercation involving Lieutenant Maria Lopez. Both parties will have the opportunity to present their cases." The first order of business was playing the video of the supermarket incident. The footage, grainy but clear enough to capture every detail, was projected onto a large screen at the front of the room. Spectators watched silently as Greg confronted Maria, his tone escalating until he drew his weapon. Gasps rippled through the crowd when the camera zoomed in on Maria's calm expression as she held up her military ID. The clip ended abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Captain Lewis turned to Greg. "Officer Miller, can you explain your actions during this encounter?" Greg stood slowly, clearing his throat before speaking. "At the time, I believed I was acting appropriately," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "I observed Lieutenant Lopez speaking Spanish and assumed there might be cause for concern. When she refused to comply with my request for identification, I felt it necessary to escalate the situation." Maria's attorney, Angela, raised an eyebrow. "Refused to comply?" she interjected skeptically. "With all due respect, Captain, the video clearly shows Lieutenant Lopez presenting her military ID immediately after being asked. There was no refusal." Captain Lewis nodded, jotting down a note. "Continue, Officer Miller." Greg hesitated, his face reddening under the scrutiny of the room. I may have misjudged the situation," he admitted reluctantly. "But I assure you I never intended to harm anyone. I was simply doing my duty as a police officer." Angela shook her head, unimpressed. "Your duty, Officer Miller, involved pulling a loaded firearm on a decorated Army officer in a public setting. That's not just poor judgment, it's reckless and dangerous behavior." Next, it was Maria's turn to speak. She rose gracefully, her eyes scanning the room before settling on the review board. "What happened that day should never have occurred," she began, her voice steady and measured. "I am a U.S. citizen, a veteran, and a mother. Yet because of my ethnicity and language, I was treated as a threat. This is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern of bias and discrimination within law enforcement. Her..." Words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement. Maria went on to describe her service record, highlighting her 2 tours overseas and numerous commendations for bravery. She emphasized the sacrifices she and countless others had made for their country, only to face prejudice upon returning home. "When people see someone like me speaking Spanish," she continued, "they shouldn't assume I'm suspicious or undocumented. They should recognize that diversity is a strength, not a weakness, and they should understand that trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve is essential. Witnesses were called to testify, including several shoppers who had been present during the altercation. One woman recounted how terrified she had been when Greg drew his gun, fearing for her safety and the safety of her children. Another witness, a retired teacher, praised Maria's composure and professionalism, calling her a role model for young women everywhere. As the hearing progressed, it became increasingly clear that public opinion was firmly on Maria's side. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, capturing every word spoken during the proceedings. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Maria" and "Accountability Matters." Some chanted slogans, their voices echoing through the halls. Finally, after hours of testimony and deliberation, the review board reached a decision. Captain Lewis addressed the room once more. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented today, we find Officer Gregory Miller guilty of misconduct and gross negligence. Effective immediately, he is terminated from the police force and stripped of his badge." A wave of applause erupted from the audience, though it was quickly silenced by Captain Lewis raising a hand. "Let this serve as a reminder that our actions have consequences," he added solemnly. Law enforcement officers are entrusted with protecting and serving all members of the community, regardless of race, ethnicity, or background. Failure to uphold these principles undermines the very foundation of justice. For Greg, the verdict felt like a punch to the gut. He slumped back into his chair, staring blankly at the floor as the reality of his situation sank in. He had lost more than his job. He had lost his identity, his sense of purpose. As the crowd filed out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed him, asking for comment. But Greg remained silent, his jaw clenched tightly as he pushed past them. Maria, on the other hand, received a hero's welcome. Supporters surrounded her, offering hugs and words of encouragement. Someone handed her flowers while another person thanked her for standing up against injustice. Though grateful for the support, Maria couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. She knew the fight wasn't over, not for her, and certainly not for others facing similar challenges. Later that evening, Maria returned home to find Carlos waiting for her. He embraced her warmly, pride shining in his eyes. "You did good today," he said softly. "Really good." Maria smiled faintly, leaning into his arms. "It's just the beginning," she replied. "There's still so much work to do." Meanwhile, Greg sat alone in his living room, nursing a drink and staring at the wall. Linda had gone to bed hours ago, unable to bear the weight of his despair any longer. For the first time in years, Greg allowed himself to cry, not out of self-pity but out of genuine remorse. He realized now how deeply his actions had hurt Maria and countless others like her, and though he couldn't undo the past, he vowed to do better moving forward. The fallout from the hearing dominated headlines for days. Opinion pieces debated the implications of Greg's termination, with some praising the decision as a victory for accountability and others arguing it set a dangerous precedent. Social media buzzed with reactions, ranging from celebratory posts to heated arguments about policing and racial bias. Amid the chaos, Maria focused on channeling her energy into meaningful action. She accepted invitations to speak at schools, community centers, and advocacy events, using her platform to promote understanding and reform. Each speech brought her closer to her goal of bridging divides and fostering dialogue between law enforcement and minority communities. Greg, too, began taking small steps toward redemption. Encouraged by Kevin's advice, he reached out to local organizations working to combat systemic racism and volunteered his time whenever possible. It wasn't easy. Many people distrusted him or dismissed his efforts outright, but he persisted, determined to prove that change was possible. Though their paths remained separate, both Maria and Greg carried the lessons of the hearing with them. The road ahead promised to be difficult, but it also held the potential for growth, healing, and transformation. In their own ways, they were learning to confront the mistakes of the past and build a better future, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. Months passed since the disciplinary hearing, and life slowly began to settle into new rhythms for both Greg Miller and Maria Lopez. The initial shock of the incident had faded, replaced by quieter moments of reflection and action. For Greg, the days were filled with uncertainty as he struggled to redefine himself without the badge that had once defined his identity. For Maria, the spotlight remained steady, but she used it wisely, channeling her energy into advocacy work that aimed to create lasting change. One crisp autumn morning, Greg found himself sitting at a cafe table staring blankly at the newspaper in front of him. An article about Maria caught his eye. She was speaking at a national conference about police reform and community relations. Her photo showed her smiling warmly, surrounded by supporters holding signs that read, "Unity through understanding." Greg felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about how much courage it must have taken for her to rise above the pain he had caused. That evening, Greg sat down with a pen and paper, unsure of what to write, but knowing he needed to try. After several drafts, he finally composed a letter addressed to Maria. It wasn't perfect, but it came from a place of sincerity. "Dear Lieutenant Lopez, I know there's nothing I can say to undo what happened that day at the supermarket. My actions were wrong and they hurt you deeply. I want to apologize, not because I feel forced to, but because I truly regret what I did. You didn't deserve any of it. I've spent these past months trying to understand where I went wrong, not just with you, but in so many other situations throughout my career. I realize now that I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I'm working hard to change that. If you're willing, I'd like to meet with you to hear your thoughts and hopefully begin to make amends. Sincerely, Greg Miller." Greg mailed the letter the next day, feeling equal parts hopeful and terrified. Days stretched into weeks, and just when he thought Maria might ignore his request, he received a reply. Her response was brief but thoughtful. "Mr. Miller, I appreciate your apology and your willingness to take responsibility for your actions. Meeting isn't something I take lightly, but I believe even small steps toward reconciliation are important. Let's talk." Respectfully, Maria Lopez, they agreed to meet at a local park known for its peaceful scenery. On the chosen afternoon, Greg arrived early, clutching a small bouquet of flowers as a token of goodwill. He chose a bench near the lake, watching as ducks glided across the water. His heart raced as he waited, replaying possible scenarios in his mind. What if she rejected his apology outright? What if he said the wrong thing? When Maria appeared, Greg stood up awkwardly, holding out the flowers. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "These are for you." Maria accepted the bouquet with a nod, her expression neutral but not unfriendly. She sat down on the opposite end of the bench, leaving a comfortable distance between them. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant laughter of children playing nearby. "You wanted to apologize in person," Maria said finally, breaking the silence. "Why?" Greg hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because saying sorry in a letter didn't feel like enough. I needed you to see that I mean it, that I'm truly sorry for what I did. Not just because people expect me to be, but because I know I was wrong." Maria studied him closely, searching for sincerity in his eyes. "Do you understand why it mattered so much?" she asked gently. "Why pulling a gun on me wasn't just about one bad decision?" Greg nodded slowly. "Yes. I treated you like a threat because of your ethnicity and language. I made assumptions instead of seeing you as a person, a decorated officer who served our country honorably. That wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't right." Maria sighed, her gaze drifting toward the lake. "It's not just about me, though. People like me, Hispanic, Black, Asian, they deal with this kind of treatment all the time. We walk into stores, drive our cars, go to work, and we never know when someone might decide we don't belong. It's exhausting." "I didn't think about that before," Greg admitted quietly. "But I do now, and I hate that I contributed to that feeling. I want to do better. For everyone." Maria turned back to him, her expression softening slightly. "Apologies are important, but actions matter more. Are you ready to actually change?" Greg met her gaze steadily. I'm trying. I've been volunteering with groups focused on racial justice and attending workshops to unlearn some of the biases I didn't even realize I had. It's hard, but I'm committed to doing the work. Maria nodded, seeming to consider his words. Good, because real change takes time and effort. If you're serious, then keep going. Don't give up when things get uncomfortable. They talked for nearly an hour, sharing stories and perspectives. Maria opened up about her experiences as a Latina woman in the military, describing moments of triumph as well as frustration. Greg listened intently, asking questions and acknowledging the challenges she faced. In turn, he shared his struggles with redefining himself after losing his job and grappling with shame. By the end of their conversation, the tension between them had eased somewhat. Maria rose from the bench, extending her hand. Thank you for coming today, she said sincerely. This isn't forgiveness, it's a start. Keep working on yourself, Greg. That's how you'll make a difference. Greg shook her hand, gratitude washing over him. Thank you, Maria, for everything. As they parted ways, each carried a renewed sense of purpose. For Greg, the meeting reinforced his commitment to becoming a better version of himself, not just for Maria, but for the broader community he hoped to serve someday. For Maria, it was a reminder that even those who cause harm can grow and contribute positively if given the chance. In the weeks that followed, Greg threw himself into his volunteer work, mentoring young people and participating in discussions about systemic racism. He started journaling, documenting his progress and reflecting on his journey. Slowly but surely, he began rebuilding trust with those around him, including Linda, who noticed a newfound humility in her husband. Maria continued her advocacy efforts, traveling the country to speak at events and organize workshops. She partnered with organizations led by veterans and minority leaders, amplifying voices often overlooked in conversations about reform. Though the road ahead remained challenging, she found solace in knowing that every step forward brought her closer to a world where incidents like hers wouldn't happen again. Both Greg and Maria understood that healing wasn't linear. It required patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But as they moved forward, separately yet connected by their shared experience, they held on to hope. Hope that individuals could change, hope that communities could unite, and hope that the future could be brighter than the past. Months turned into a year since the supermarket incident, and both Greg Miller and Maria Lopez had grown in ways neither could have imagined at the time. Their lives continued to evolve separately, but their paths remained intertwined through the ripple effects of that fateful day. Each had embraced their roles in shaping a better future, one driven by accountability, understanding, and action. Maria stood on a stage in a bustling city park, addressing thousands of people who had come together for a rally focused on justice, reform. The event was organized by a coalition of advocacy groups, including several she now worked closely with. As she looked out over the sea of faces, she felt a deep sense of purpose. These were ordinary people, students, parents, veterans, activists, all united by a shared desire for change. Today, Maria began, her voice ringing out clearly, we gather not just to protest injustice, but to celebrate resilience. We are here because we believe in a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or background. The crowd erupted into applause, holding up signs and chanting slogans like, "Accountability matters" and "One community, one future." Maria paused, letting the energy wash over her before continuing. What happened to me last year was painful, she admitted, her tone softening. But it also gave me an opportunity to speak out, to push for reforms, and to remind us all that our differences should be celebrated, not feared. Together we can build bridges between communities and law enforcement. Together we can create a system rooted in trust and fairness. Her speech resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement or wiped away tears. Among them was Greg Miller, standing quietly near the back of the crowd. He had debated whether to attend the rally, unsure if his presence would be welcomed. But something inside him, a mix of guilt, determination, and hope, had compelled him to come. As Maria spoke, Greg listened intently, reflecting on how far he'd come since the hearing. Losing his job had been devastating, but it forced him to confront truths about himself he might otherwise have ignored. Over the past year, he had immersed himself in volunteer work, joining programs aimed at educating youth about bias and fostering dialogue between police officers and minority communities. He even started mentoring teenagers from underserved neighborhoods, sharing stories about the importance of self-awareness and empathy. Though some people still distrusted him, Greg didn't let that discourage him. He knew earning back trust would take time, and he was willing to put in the effort. Today, watching Maria inspire such a massive crowd, he felt a renewed sense of motivation. If she could rise above what he had done to her, then surely he could continue striving to be better, for himself and for others. After the rally ended, Maria stepped down from the stage, surrounded by well-wishers eager to thank her. She smiled, warmly, shaking hands and posing for photos. Amid the chaos, she spotted Greg standing off to the side, looking hesitant. For a moment, their eyes met, and Maria gave him a small, acknowledging nod. It wasn't forgiveness, it couldn't erase the past, but it was recognition of the progress he had made. Greg approached cautiously, unsure of what to say. "Lieutenant Lopez," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I just wanted to tell you how much your speech meant to me. You're making a real difference." Maria studied him for a moment, then offered a faint smile. "Thank you, Greg. I appreciate that. And I see the work you're doing too. Keep going, it matters." Her words filled him with gratitude, and he nodded silently before stepping back to let others engage with her. As he walked away, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not because everything was fixed, but because he knew he was on the right path. Back home, Greg sat at his kitchen table flipping through photos from the rally. Linda joined him, glancing over his shoulder. "You look happier," she observed softly. "Like you found your place again." "I think I have," Greg replied, smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. "It's not the same as before, but maybe that's okay. Maybe this is where I'm supposed to be." Meanwhile, Maria returned to her family, exhausted but fulfilled. Carlos greeted her at the door with a hug, while their kids bombarded her with questions about the rally. "Did you talk about us?" her youngest son asked excitedly. Maria laughed, ruffling his hair. "Of course I did. I told everyone about how brave my family is." That evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Maria reflected on the journey she'd been on. The incident at the supermarket had tested her patience, strength, and faith in humanity. But it had also shown her the power of resilience and the importance of using one's voice for good. She thought about Greg, about the letter he had written, and the apology he had offered. Though their meeting had been brief, it represented something larger, a chance for healing, however small, in a fractured world. The following weeks brought more opportunities for growth and connection. Maria traveled to schools and community centers, leading workshops designed to foster understanding between law enforcement and civilians. She partnered with former colleagues to develop training programs for police officers, emphasizing cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Her efforts earned widespread praise, but she remained humble, always reminding herself that the fight for justice was far from over. Greg, too, continued his journey of redemption. He became a regular speaker at local events, sharing his story openly and encouraging others to examine their own biases. Some listeners were skeptical, challenging him during Q&A sessions. But Greg welcomed the questions, knowing they came from a place of wanting to understand. Slowly, he began to rebuild relationships within his community, proving through consistent action that he was committed to change. By the end of the year, both Maria and Greg had become symbols of hope in their own ways. Maria represented resilience and leadership, showing others how to channel pain into purpose. Greg embodied accountability and transformation, demonstrating that even those who make grave mistakes can learn and grow. Together, though apart, They inspired countless individuals to join the movement for justice and equality. In the final scene of this chapter of their lives, Maria stood once again on a stage, this time at a national conference dedicated to bridging divides between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Behind her hung a banner with bold letters. Together, we build a better future. As she delivered her closing remarks, her voice carried conviction and optimism. The road ahead won't be easy, she said, scanning the diverse audience. But every step we take brings us closer to a world where no one has to prove they belong, where trust replaces fear and unity triumphs over division. Let's keep moving forward together. The crowd rose to its feet, erupting into cheers and applause. Among them, Greg watched silently, his heart swelling with pride and resolve. He knew the journey wasn't over, for any of them, but he also knew they were heading in the right direction. And sometimes, that was enough.